Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my list of the top 5 sports psychology stories of 2016. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to run through my second annual list of the top sports psychology stories of the year. What were the big issues in performance science in 2016? By the way, you can find my 2015 list by going back to episode 15D. Once again, rather than being based on some complex analysis of citations, page views, or something like that, these are just stories that caught my eye this year. But before diving into that, I wanted to give you a few updates about the podcast in general and put a request out there. I'm not sure how many of you listen to new episodes right after they come out, but if you do, you may have noticed I took a little holiday break the last few weeks. What have I been up to? Well, I have a few exciting new research studies that I'm writing up now, and I'll tell you about soon. I've also been doing a ton of running. Over the last few months, I ran my first 50-miler, my first 100K, and managed to qualify for the Boston Marathon somehow. Moving forward with the podcast, my plan is to settle into a pattern of one episode per week, released on Tuesdays generally. And that is where you come in. First, if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like me to cover, please let me know. I would be more than happy to do a Q&A type episode. Second, I'm about to start setting up interviews again, and this time around I'd like to particularly focus on practitioners working in the field, so coaches, trainers, sports psychologists, etc. If you'd be interested in talking about your career and some of your coaching philosophies, please do let me know. Also, if there's a particular person you think would be a good guest, that would be great too. For all of these things, you can email me at robgray@asu.edu or message me on Twitter. You can find me at ShakyWeights. Okay, on to the top 5 stories of 2016.
I tell you folks, it's harder than it looks. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.
Top story number 5, the death knell for brain games? In my 2015 list, the number 1 story was, quote, generalized perceptual cognitive training in sports, science or snake oil, unquote. Well, things got pretty oily in 2016. It was a very rough year if you're a brain game salesman. It was bookended by 2 hard body blows to this area. 2016 started with Lumosity having to pay $2 million to settle a lawsuit against them, charging them with deceptive claims, which resulted in a complete left turn in their business strategy. See episode 22E. And the year ended with Dan Simons and colleagues publishing their magnus opus, an 83-page analysis titled, Do Brain Training Programs Work? This appeared in the journal Psychological Science for the Public Interest. Here is a summary of their findings. Quote, based on this examination, we find extensive evidence that brain training interventions improve performance on the trained tasks, less evidence that such interventions improve performance on closely related tasks, and little evidence that training enhances performance on distantly related tasks, or that training improves everyday cognitive performance. We also find that many of the published intervention studies had major shortcomings in design or analysis that preclude definitive conclusions about the efficacy of training, and that none of the cited studies conform to all of the best practices we identify as essential to drawing clear conclusions about the benefits of brain training for everyday activities. End quote. Ouch! I'm not going to get into detail about this article, but it addresses many of the issues I've been talking about since the beginning of this podcast. Moving forward, the one exception to all of this that I'm interested to see where it goes is NeuroTracker. As I've discussed on the podcast a few times now, this technology is rapidly growing in popularity. A few weeks ago, I was contacted to do a newspaper interview about it. The reporter knew my reservations from listening to the podcast, But his main point was, how come so many people are using it if it doesn't work? My response was, a lot of Olympic athletes seem to be using cupping too. It doesn't mean it has any scientific validity. But anyways, I think neural tracking would be a really interesting test case. It is a somewhat unique situation. Its widespread usage means a lot of data can be collected, which avoids the issue of underpowered studies which plagues this area. And Jocelyn Faubert definitely has the resources and know-how to do proper transfer of training research in the future. Just make sure these studies are better than the one I reviewed back in episode 21C. Top story number 4, deliberate practice fights back. As I talked about back in episode 17, there's been a lot of blowback against Anders Ericsson's theory of deliberate practice over the last few years, in a large part due to it being lumped in with the 10,000-hour rule described by Malcolm Gladwell. We also have books like The Sports Gene by David Epstein, which argues that giftedness and genetics are really the key to success in many sports, an idea which goes completely against deliberate practice theory. Well, it seems like this year, supporters of deliberate practice have started to push back a little. This includes Anders' new book, The New Science of Expertise, which we discussed in our interview back in episode 17D, and some interesting new research that goes beyond just counting the number of hours of practice and digs a bit deeper into what goes into those hours. There also seems to have been a bit of softening on the strict idea that all deliberate practice must be unenjoyable. Finally, there's the interesting idea that Anders raised that elite athletes may have a genetic disposition which allows them to engage in deliberate practice more frequently. As I've said before, I think we have to be careful not to throw the deliberate practice baby out with the 10,000-hour bathwater. Like any theory, I think it needs to continue to develop, and I look forward to seeing more research in this area in the future. Top story number 3, what to do about the relative age effect. It has received so much publicity, I think almost anyone working in sports science or coaching can tell you what the relative age effect or RAE is now. Kids that are relatively older, that is those that are born closer to the start of the season in a particular sport, have an advantage in that they tend to get selected in developmental programs more often. Or, stated another way, many talent evaluators confound current physical stature with future potential. But I think if you ask the same people what is being done about the RAE, you would hear a lot of, well, I think in 2016 a couple developments were highlighted that are highly relevant to this issue. The first is the highly innovative study by Dave Mann and colleagues, which showed that by making scouts aware of the relative age effects of the players in a very simple way and very direct way, the RAE effect on talent evaluation can be reduced. Specifically, using shirt numbering to indicate relative age. I think this is a really nice idea because it presents the information in such an easily accessible way, which does not require the scout to take their eyes off the players to look at a long list of birth dates on a clipboard, for example. The other development in this area is the one I talked about back in episode 35C, the reversal of the relative age effect. This is the finding that although athletes that are relatively younger may have a disadvantage at the start of their career, this may flip to being an advantage at the highest level of a sport, where it has been shown that the birth date effect can completely reverse. The main explanation for this is that being overlooked when you're younger serves to make athletes more resilient and mentally tougher. While I think this is a fascinating finding that gives all the underdogs out there hope, I worry a bit about its practical implications. Does this provide support for the strategy used in many current youth academies of putting young athletes through the ringer and seeing who survives? I sure hope not. We definitely need more research to understand how we can make young athletes mentally tough, while at the same time keeping sport enjoyable and avoiding burnout and dropout. Top story number 2, advances in teamwork research. One of the areas in which I think sports science is going to make its greatest strides in the next few years is in the area of teamwork. Largely for practical reasons, the vast majority of sports science research in the past has focused on the performance from the perspective of an individual athlete. More recently, the combination of advances in technology, like GPS, which allows us to record the movements of multiple players simultaneously, and some important theoretical advances have started to move this field forward in a big way. A prime example of this is the work by Duarte Araujo, Keith Davids, and colleagues, which has involved the application of ecological dynamics to the understanding of teamwork. For example, see the review article published in September of this year, which does an excellent job explaining the key theoretical idea of shared affordances. Link in the show notes. For me, this work represents a huge step forward because it moves teamwork research from primarily an offline focus, where we try to understand how individual athletes acquire shared knowledge during instruction and practice, to giving us tools to study team coordination online, that is, during actual play. I have also started to dip my toe in this area a bit in collaboration with my colleagues Nancy Cook and Nathan McNeese. Last year we wrote a few review articles looking at different approaches to understanding team cognition. Also, we have a study that will be published later this year in a special issue of the journal Frontiers titled Understanding the Successful Coordination of Team Behavior. In this new research, we developed a novel joint decision-making paradigm and applied it to understanding the coordination of infielders in baseball. More to come on that in the future. Top story number 1. Somebody's watching or monitoring me. From what I've been hearing, this is probably going to be the biggest story of 2017, but I think it was also important this year. As I discussed in my report on the Sports Biometric Conference in episode 40B, the issue of what type of information should we be collecting from an athlete, how it should be used, and who owns it is going to be a critical one moving forward if we're going to be able to take full potential of the health and performance monitoring technologies that are continuing to be developed. Should team owners be able to monitor an athlete's sleep pattern 24/7? Should things like EEG and heart rate data be brought into contract negotiations the way interceptions and home runs are now? Also, I think there's a lot of important research to be done to understand the best way to get an athlete involved in performance monitoring. So I look forward to seeing more of what the future brings in this area. Well, that's my list of the top stories for 2016. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, how do anger and frustration affect perception and performance? To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. And remember, if you are or know a coach or other practitioner that you think would be a good fit with this podcast for an interview, please contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter at ShakyWeights. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
If tears were liquor